Welcome to another episode of Code for Thought. The following recording is the edited version of a SORSE panel discussion from this February in 2021. While the coronavirus pandemic has been stopping us from attending conferences, SORSE provided a series of online events for research software engineers between autumn 2020 and spring 2021. This particular event was titled Research on the Go, and in there we discuss how mobile apps fit into the work that research software engineers do. The panelists include Adrian Harwood and Patricia Barnby from the University of Manchester in the UK, and Mark Turner from the University of Newcastle in the UK. And as per usual, we start the discussion with a round of introductions.
Yep, hi, so I'm Adrian Harwood. So my background, I've probably spent the last 10 years in university research, so I went through the whole academic system from a PhD student to a postdoc and then ultimately to a lecturer. My field of research was in and around computational fluid dynamics in aerospace engineering. Most of the code I wrote during that time was in C, C++, Java, CUDA for GPUs, OpenGL. And I moved to the RSE team in Manchester about 2 years ago, initially to manage all the mobile and GPU related projects that they get into the team. But having arrived, it was clear that the job was much bigger than we initially led to believe. So it changed my role significantly.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much. Patricia, you're working with Adrian, I understand, in Manchester. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. Unlike Adrian, I've got a background in computer science. I have many years in both private and public industry. And then I first got involved in research software as a Java contractor at AstraZeneca on the Genomic Initiative in 2001. Found that very interesting. I then came to Manchester University, worked in a proteomics laboratory, again in research software, and started with Adrian at the onset really of MDS in May 2019. So I've sort of had always a computing background, not really done much research until I got involved at those stages and never looked back really enjoy working in research.
Okay, finally, we are leaving the University of Manchester and move swiftly over to the University of Newcastle to Mark Turner.
So my name's Mark Turner and I lead the research software engineering team at Newcastle. My background has always been in computing. I did my undergraduate and then left research to go into industry, did a few years there, quickly realized I preferred research. So I came back, did an MSc at Newcastle, and one of my supervisors then offered me a job as a software engineer, or would later become a research software engineer. This is before the phrase was such a thing. Over time, built up my expertise and slowly started building up a team. That's been very successful, to the point where I don't write an awful lot of code these days because I've got a team to do it for me. So much the better, I would say.
The theme for today is mobile applications. And when I listen to your background, none of us here on the panel actually have a background specifically in mobile app development, but yet you got into mobile app development. So how did that happen?
So I guess I got into it really because it was a direct result of the research that I did. So my field of research was what we called interactive real-time fluid simulations. So basically what this means is it's trying to simulate things like air and water physics, but doing it in real time and doing it in a way that a user can do what's called computational steering, which is to be able to change a simulation's parameters as it's running through things like touch screens and virtual reality and that kind of thing. So I spent most of my research just sort of writing Android apps and writing solvers and visualization and shaders and things for basically doing the simulation bit on GPUs and some bits of visualization, and then combining that inside an Android app, of which you needed to know the Android SDK. So if you wanted to do things like have it respond to device orientation or something like this, if using essentially a gravity vector or something, you need to tap into the device sensors. I published a few papers on this, but one of them was basically where we actually had a cluster of these devices where they computed the simulation across like a peer-to-peer bunch of them. So we had like 4 tablets all number crunching a portion of the simulation. And it was quite cool, but obviously you end up writing an app essentially, and then just kind of embedding your physics solver inside it. So I made the move to realize that I just wanted to write I enjoyed writing the app more than I enjoyed doing the numerics of and the mathematics. So the rest is history, I suppose. But when I arrived in the RSE team, it was quite clear that the demand for mobile apps was such that it needed a proper formalized service with governance and the rest of it to be able to make that work.
Patricia.
So I got into writing apps because about 6 or 7 years ago, I did a full-time master's in advanced computer science. And one of the modules was mobile development. And I really enjoyed it. I did that as part of my actual project as well, along with smartwatch development. And then I managed to get a full-time permanent position with the RSE team. And Adrian and somebody called Joshua Woodcock happened to do an open road show. And it coincided with me starting on RSE, and he just had such enthusiasm and it just sounded interesting and fun that I thought, right, well, I really fancy going on that team then. And I enjoyed the mobile, so I expressed an interest and just jumped at the chance when I was able to start on the MDS team.
Mark?
So I came at it from a slightly different direction, given my background is in web development, especially sort of user interface design. So I was doing websites around the time where there was this big push to be what later became sort of mobile first in terms of a responsive design. So I'm only talking about user interface elements at this point. And then we got a couple of projects where people wanted that plus some interaction with the sensors, most commonly like the camera. So it's a case of, can we have a mobile website that can also take photos? So it was that gradual move into mobile app development, but via web technologies, which is, I guess, different from the others.
There is a need for mobile apps in research. So that's clearly what I'm hearing. I'm seeing that also at UCL. So what's the demand actually look like? Was it more than you can handle? Is it just about enough?
I mean, I can answer the situation of how it's developed for us over the last couple of years. So when I first joined, there was, maybe one active mobile app that needed looking after and a couple of requests for them. So it was very much manageable by one person. And when I booted up the mobile development service, it was essentially like booting up a startup company. There was me as the only developer and the service lead. So I just kind of did everything. And thankfully, Patricia joined. By the time she did, we were seeing around about one new app request every month. So in the first year of the service, we built 12 apps. So that's the equivalent of kind of one a month with only kind of 1.5 people in the first year. And in year two, well, we're not at the end of year two of the service yet, but we've already done 10 and we've got 6 more in the pipeline that are due to be started. So you're probably looking at least a dozen apps a year, and that's only rising. We've had to take on another developer as well. So there's 3 of us that do it now. It's just it seems to be never ending, really. I think it seems to be a word of mouth type thing. So you do a good job for one person, and then they tell their colleagues, and then you get another request, and so on. So it sort of grows like that, really.
Yes, and we also have repeat orders as well, where they actually have come back and wanted to extend their existing app and have grander ideas on what to do. And Adrian's also sort of expanded the services that we give on our team. We don't just do a full development from A to B, from onset of requirements right through to testing and release. We also do different levels of service. So if people just want them releasing by us, we can do that. Or if they want support and they want us as consultants, we have support apps where they, will just mentor people and see them once a fortnight or a week and have a weekly meeting and give them input. So we've got work in different areas as well as doing for the full-blown app as well. So we've got quite a lot of different types of work going on.
From the Newcastle side, we're obviously a long way behind Manchester, both in terms of size and scope of the RSE team and our involvement in mobile apps. I think we're starting to see a rising trend of people inquiring about it, but it's not yet at the levels where it's sort of one a month. But I think that will definitely get there. We're seeing requests. The sort of most interesting thing to me is less the volume at the moment and more about where they're coming from. So at the moment, I've got conversations ongoing with academics where they're talking about getting funding for something in all 3 of Newcastle's faculties. So that's sort of the engineering, the medical sciences and the humanities, and we would build mobile apps in all of those. It's not like one particular research domain is driving demand, it's really everywhere.
There's a little bit more involved than just writing code when it comes to mobile app development. Usually you deploy them, say, to the App Store, whether it's Google Store or the App Store or the Apple App Store. There is ongoing maintenance, right? There's the annual OS updates, bug fixing, deployment logistics, etc., etc., etc. And also, of course, the question of user interface design. So I'd be keen to find out a little bit more how you guys handle all of that.
One of the slight differences we have to Newcastle is we're actually responsible for deploying our own apps. We have a sort of app, what they call an app manager or an admin type account on the store. The actual App Store and Play Store accounts are owned by IT services at Manchester, but research IT, of which my team sits, is part of IT services. So we have naturally a devolved privilege to be able to directly deploy our apps ourselves. That's both a blessing and a curse, because it means that, yes, all of our processes can be completely joined up end to end. But at the same time, as you say, it's that added responsibility, because we are also responsible for the governance process, which I think one of the questions actually touches on this is how does ethics play a part in app release? And essentially, this is part of a governance process that I have to look after in my role. So you kind of have to be a service lead, a project manager, and a technical expert all at the same time. It's just what the job's become. But sitting inside IT services means all that joins up nicely. It ties in nicely with the governance aspects of research software. We've recently expanded our remit to include teaching as well. So we have a parallel process for the governance of teaching, learning, and students' apps. So yeah, it's just a growing remit.
Patricia, anything to add from your end?
There is an awful lot to it, which is probably going into the challenges of working on this team, but sort of part of this process is due diligence to make sure that what we're releasing with the apps, that they're good apps and they've been tested properly. And that's one of the problems of ensuring we release only apps that have been tested on lots of different variety of devices, and that they've taken into account things like accessibility, which is very important. And certainly we've had some technical issues with the stack. We use Xamarin, where there are some bugs to do with accessibility, and we've just had to make sure that we're very transparent and open on what things we're able to meet and what things we've had to let go. So there's a lot of sort of governance in how we release our apps, and like Adrian says, quite a lot of responsibility as well. And there's just an awful lot to it, not just developing. On the technical side of developing an app, it's everything around it. There's an awful lot of work involved.
Mark?
I don't have too much to add on all of this, the bits you guys have talked about already. I would add, for the sort of user interface design point that you asked, we would use third-party libraries to give you that leg up to try and do things in the right way rather than build things from scratch. Just like common components and building blocks that you can put together that are going to give you a hand with those accessibility features and things like that. So you've almost got to try really hard to do it wrong, and these tools are quite useful for holding your hand and getting you to do things the right way. And after that, it's really just repeating what you both said. It's just a long process, isn't it? A long pipeline from code base to release. There's not much glamour in there. There's nothing particularly exciting, but it all needs doing.
So when people think about deploying their own applications, and thank you for highlighting that, there is actually quite a lot more to sort out. There is also what I quite appreciate that you mentioned, Patricia, the testing aspect, because it's not enough to really test things on a simulator. You really need to get it out on the hardware. And there are a couple of solutions available. I'm not quite sure what you're taking, but so for instance, there are device farms out there where you can sort of hire some service and then you deploy an application, you can bring it out on different, and particularly for Android, where there's far more than an iOS. But even iOS is not that straightforward anymore. How do you handle that? So how do you do the testing pipeline? I mean, how do you make sure the thing works on all these various different device types and form factors?
Just before I answer that question, I just wanted to mention one thing more on the UI design. I should say that for all our projects, quite often the customer, who is the researcher, sometimes just doesn't care about UI design. And ultimately, we just have to make a call as a team, we try best to stay on top of things like the material design guidelines. We use those resources quite frequently to just check how we're laying things out. Yes, we end up having to do the UI design ourselves with wireframes before we build the app. We also have an option in Manchester to farm the UI design side out to marketing and comms, and they will do it for us because they're proper graphic designers. The proviso is that we give them a slice of the budget, and that's obviously something that the researchers quite often don't want to give up a slice of their budget for UI design, so they're quite happy for us to just use our best judgment. In terms of testing then, we actually are quite fortunate because being part of IT services, we have access to an Azure subscription. So we actually use what's called the Xamarin Test Cloud, which is essentially a room full of physical devices that you can run automated tests on. The tech stack we use, the Xamarin tech stack, has a UI test and NuGet package that's essentially a variant on NUnit. And you can write unit tests and you can write UI tests in your app and basically just deploy them to the test cloud. You can test on 200 plus devices.
But that implies also some kind of automated testing level, doesn't it?
Yes, it's automated. I mean, we obviously do what we can manually, and we also have a user acceptance testing procedure. We use the beta test facilities and test flight on the store. Patricia, you'd agree with me here that we do so much testing before the app goes into production, automated and manual. I don't recall us ever having a post-production bug that we had to fix.
The problem is that some of the apps that we do are relatively small, so they haven't got the budget, because if you're writing using NUnit and these automated tests, sometimes you can actually double the development time because you have to write the test, then you have to test it. Then if you use an agile and you go back and forth with the sprints, they change their mind and we change, we have to adapt to requirements. So then you rewrite the tests. So there's quite a big overhead with actually introducing, and there's a cost, there's a monthly cost for the subscription. So that all, when Adrian's doing quotes on that, we all have to take that into consideration of whether or not it's worthwhile for a very straightforward app to actually go to that extent. But then, so if it's an app that they want to run for another 10 years or whatever, we would definitely have to do it, and it was out to a wide variety of the public. But if it was only for a small cohort of people and we knew the devices, we probably then wouldn't go to that extent of doing the automated testing. Again, if there's a bug that if it's released and there's a bug that we can't reproduce on the emulators, me and Adrian only have a single Android device each, and we're using our own Apple phones to test because we work for the university, so it's very restricted. So this is part of the process when we're talking to people of what is important for them in their app, whether they want extensive testing on 200 plus different devices and operating systems, or whether they want to focus on getting something good fit for purpose within their grant means. But as Adrian has said, testing is just massive all the way through, user acceptance testing, our own testing, peer testing, beta testing once it goes into release, and then obviously the maintenance and any testing if there's any bugs that we put right. So it's a massive part of our process.
We have a minimum standard, don't we? So we say that everything has to be tested on the latest OS, the earliest OS that you support, both phones, tablets, any kind of combination. But there's kind of a minimum subset of physical device tests that we do, and we insist every app is put through. But as Patricia said, it's a sliding scale. There's anything upwards from that minimum, really, you've got to judge whether it's worth the budget and whether the budget's available.
Mark, any comments from you?
We don't have that level of rigor with app development just because we don't do enough of it. I think it's a function of not having a dedicated mobile app person. We would typically just test on physical devices, and a lot of the mobile development we've done has not been meant for mass participation. It's been to be run by a couple of researchers on their devices. So we would play a little fast and loose with what devices we're targeting and just do it that way. We've had projects where the thing we've actually been building is really a prototype to strengthen a funding application where you're then going to rebuild the app and do it properly. And that really has been sort of like quick and dirty. It's what can you do in 6 weeks just to try and impress the funder. So it's got to look like it works, even if it doesn't actually.
A question that I have encountered many, many times, which is the native versus cross-platform. So I'm pretty opinionated on that one, but I'm going to hold back because I'd like to get your take on this. What would the criteria be for you to say, okay, I'm going to go native. This is more suitable for native development, and, oh no, well, hang on, we probably can do this much better for React Native. Where do you actually draw the line, and how do you decide that?
So I've had to make this call. When we booted up the service, I had to decide what we were going to do. So first of all, I should say that we chose a cross-platform framework. I've been very happy with that decision. So I'll start with that. I'll also say, though, that I don't sit in one camp and firmly. I think we've done a couple of projects that have been native. So we did one, Patricia just say a bit more later maybe, about which was written in Java using the Android SDK. So straight written in Android Studio as if you were writing an Android app from scratch. I did one only a few weeks ago, which was maintaining an app that was written in Objective-C, which was a horrible experience, but had to be done. We don't insist that apps have to be done one particular way. And obviously my background was writing native Java Android apps. In fact, even more so is I used to write C code and use Java native interface to actually run pre-compiled C libraries. And the reason why I did that is because I needed absolute performance. I was running GPU simulations. I needed every spare millisecond I could get to get the thing running as fast as possible in real time. In that particular instance, I wouldn't have dreamed of using a higher level of abstraction. I absolutely needed that low level performance. But I would say that 90% of the apps we get do not need that level of performance. What they need is contact with users quickly and efficiently. So what they need is basically what a cross-platform framework brings, which is an efficient way to share code between both platforms. And obviously there are ways to do that. We went with Xamarin, but there's also React Native's been around a long time. Cordova, I believe, PhoneGap build anyway has been discontinued. So there's maybe
it's Cordova now.
Cordova is still about as an alternative. And when making a decision as to which system to use, I had to look at several things. One of them is what resources did we have in the RSE team who were essentially going to be the developers? What skills did they have? And how big a change would it be for them to retrain on a new tech stack? What skills did I have, considering I'm supposed to be the technical expert? Because I knew C, C++, and Java, converting myself to C# to write in Xamarin was a no-brainer. It requires very little effort. Syntactically, it's very similar. So that made sense. We also have a load of .NET developers in the team. So it made sense to run with a .NET framework. So Xamarin is essentially, well, next year will soon be rolled into .NET 6. It will become the de facto cross-platform mobile framework for .NET. Based on the level of abstraction that we write our apps, we probably get about a 60 to 70% code base share. So that means for every app we write, 70% of the code is packaged into a C# .NET standard library, which is shared across the Android and the iOS projects. And then the remaining 30% we write using direct C# bindings to the SDKs. So you're writing it in C#, but the Xamarin.Android and Xamarin.iOS SDKs bind straight to the Swift SDKs and the Java SDKs underneath. So you get 100% of the SDK functionality. You're just writing it in C#.
Maybe somebody else would like to say something on that subject?
I think Adrian's covered quite a lot, but really probably the only one where we went for the just Android and not cross-platform was when it was an existing app that the owner wanted to support herself, so wanted it to be enhanced and written in the same language so she could still understand it and support it later on. But as it happens, they do want to go cross-platform, so it probably will be continued on in Xamarin for future enhancements. But I think it's mainly your skill set, what you've got available, and what's quick to produce. Cross-platform is so much quicker to get apps out on both platforms.
I would echo. I think we've come down on the different side of the fence and gone sort of the web route, like with React Native, but it's for the same reasons. It's the skills you have available in the team. A lot of the team have a web background, so it makes sense to work in JavaScript or TypeScript. I'm working on an app now that's using React Native, and it's the first time I've done much mobile dev in sort of 5 years or so. And before that, I used PhoneGap. And the one thing that I've sort of noticed with that break is just how far cross-platform has come since doing, admittedly, a very old version of PhoneGap. It was horrible to use then. Now writing in React Native, it's just an absolute breeze. I love it. Absolutely, I'm like Adrian, it's a kind of case of right tool, right time, right job. We just haven't had many projects yet that have demanded that native development. It's just not been worth it. It's often for budgetary terms as well. Like if you can make efficiencies with cross-platform, it means you can do more with the budget you have from the researcher. If someone comes along with like a £5 million project and they want 3, 4, 5 developers, I might consider native just because you've got time and money to burn. But where you're trying to make efficiency savings in research, it's cross-platform's a no-brainer.
Is it really a no-brainer? So I'm gonna take a different position. So because I'm a little bit more on the native camp, which is not to say that I'm against cross-platform. And in fact, so when I was at Mendeley, we looked at different tools. Granted, that was a little while ago. It was 2017. We looked at React Native, which came out really on top, along with Xamarin, because they actually bind, as Adrian, I believe, explained, to the underlying native APIs. Right. So in React Native, you have a JavaScript bridge. So you write everything in JavaScript or in TypeScript in React. But then sort of the APIs get sort of addressed directly from the JavaScript bridge. Basically, that native aspect is hidden from you in that sense. Sometimes there is the belief that it's more effective and more efficient, when in actual fact, it turns out that maybe as the app progresses and gets more complex, it won't be. You rely largely on the availability of APIs, sort of the cross-platform APIs that eat into various different APIs of the native system. Most of the time that's covered, but then you get the cases where that isn't. Then you have to do with cross-platform plus iOS and plus Android. And the other thing, of course, is that the deployment of the application, what you're actually delivering are 2 apps. Right. So you're doing a cross-platform app, but it still ends up being an iOS app and it still ends up being an Android app, and you still need to deliver it and test it to get it to the App Store. I agree there are some cost efficiency, and for straightforward apps, a cross-platform where you're pretty sure that you don't have to eat into some kind of native components that aren't quite covered by the cross-platform APIs, then I think that sounds like a straightforward solution. When it comes to something a little bit more complicated, then you can actually add complexity rather than reduce it. So that would be my argument.
In a sense, I agree with you, but I think it does depend on how your cross-platform framework exposes the relevant platforms. So Xamarin offers a couple of ways. It offers something called a dependency service, and it offers something called custom renderers, which basically means that you can package up your own cross-platform API for the bit that you think is missing. So it's very extensible. And I think the way we've dealt with this in our team is when there's been a common call for a particular cross-platform component that doesn't exist, we've just written it ourselves, and then we can add that package, if you will, to the project. So we found that actually it has been an efficiency saving because we've just extended. So that the cross-platform component of Xamarin we use, I should say, is called Xamarin.forms. It's basically a higher level of abstraction that sits above the platform specific bits. And if it doesn't exist in forms, we'll just add it. And that's how we've got around the problem. It's never really added complexity because we still maintain that abstraction. Yes, you have to maintain the 2 platform specific bits, but I'd much prefer 70% shared, 30% platform specific than the other way around. So it still makes sense to me.
But you still need to actually have some knowledge. I think sort of the expectation usually is that, I only need to worry about React Native, but the reality is that you actually need to understand at least a little bit about Android and iOS.
Absolutely. You're absolutely correct. It doesn't save you anything in terms of knowledge of the actual platform APIs and platform SDKs. You absolutely need to know what's going on under the hood. It's just if in terms of sheer development time, it cuts down the speed at which you can build something if you build it using a cross-platform.
I hope the discussion gave you a good flavor of what's involved in bringing a mobile app to the users, from considering native or cross-platform development to how you deal with testing and user interface design. But also the other aspects of keeping apps running, such as App Store management, potential backend solutions, etc. For what you see on the device very often is just a small part of what's actually involved. For the next episode, I'll be discussing a very different subject: how to go from your research project to building your own startup business. I'll be talking to a research team who are doing just that, as well as to a CEO of an organization that helps researchers build their own businesses. I hope you'll tune in for that one. And until then, goodbye.